For the first part of our book, where it's talking about the age of expansion and the tenets of the time period and how they're labeled. So we have Romanticism, which we're coming out of at this time, where writers wrote about nature and beauty and individualism, being one's own person, um, and a lot of times the poetry and literature in particular, might have seemed um, unrealistic to celebrate nature, and that's wonderful. That's certainly a wonderful thing to do, is celebrate nature and man. But we move away from that during the time period we're studying, 1865. We've moved away from that to the writings that become what we call realism, and that means basically what it says, that it is real life, and it's not what the romantics did with making everything look beautiful and everything was wonderful. So now we move into this idea that this is real life, this is real man, with all his flaws. As humans, we certainly have our flaws and we make choices that may not be the best choices. When we talk about naturalism, the tenets of that are that particularly survival of the fittest. And I always think of, immediately, I think of Jack London, who wrote about being out in the Yukon and trying to survive in a world that typically, unless you're experienced, you wouldn't survive. You would freeze to death. So, naturalism, that idea of um, surviving and adapting to whatever world that we're set into. Um, Always, when we're studying literature, the things that I tell students to be mindful of: the time period. What's going on during the time period that the writing was written or published, because that has a lot to do with the content of um, the material, and what's represented. Are there wars going on? And there, for our textbook, where we start, certainly the Civil War, the First World War, and how that changed um, our life and humans in particular, and what we were able to do. What about religious mandates? Particularly when we're talking about early American literature, religion had a huge effect on the content, the writings. Think about the Scarlet Letter, if you're familiar with that. Um, so that was important as well. What were the morals of the time? That's important. What did people expect of other people? Always look at the background information for our writers, because that's important. Writers write what they know, and that includes us as writers, certainly. So look at their background information. That has a lot to do and maybe helps explain the content of what you're reading. When we think about fiction, and particularly for our purposes in this course, fiction is a way to escape life. I always compare it to going to the movie theaters. I love going to the movie theaters, and I've missed that terribly during this time. When we go to movies, we're in a dark theater. If it's a good movie, we're encapsulated by that. We are living in that moment, and it is escapism. And so, for writers, a lot of times that's what they're trying to do, is escaping. In in our book, it points out that we're going for this westward expansion, that that whites are particularly going west to discover new lands. Um, and that certainly has an effect. I think of Willa Cather, who's one of those writers to write about what that means, her experience of going west into unknown territory. So that's important. Railroads were important during this time. It allowed people to be able to travel, to get there rather than walking or by uh, horse and buggy. The Gilded Age, what they describe as it's an awareness of commonality from particulars of place. Writers began to construct generalities characteristic of American social and economic life as a whole. A lot of people gained, the upper class, they gained a lot of wealth during this time for the industrial movements. That's important. People began to work in factories. That changed life. So, all of these, to kind of consider these, look over the content about Walt Whitman. We're not studying a whole lot of his, just a few short um, readings by him. So look at that as that's kind of the segue into this area that we're studying. So hope this helps.